Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and today I'm going to be reviewing a hand I recently played in a $1,000 buy-in six-handed tournament. And in this hand, we started with 37,000 chips, although the two players who we're going to be against in this hand are the small blind and the big blind, who have 13,000 chips in the small blind and 25,000 in the big blind. You're always playing the shortest stack, the person who has the shortest stack in the hand. I get 9-8 suited, pretty great hand, 9-8 of clubs, and I raise to 900 on the button at 200, 400 with a 50 ante. And this seems fine to me. I'm happy to raise small if I think the players in the blinds are not going to be defending too well. If they're going to be defending a little bit better, you probably want to raise a little bit larger. Most people in high-stakes games at this point know they need to be defending the big blind a lot, so raising a little bit larger either discourages that or makes their calls not so great. But anyway, we make a small raise to only 900. Small blind calls and big blind calls. Flop comes queen of clubs, six of diamonds, two of hearts. This is a scenario where I'm very frequently going to be making a continuation bet against two players or one player. And that's because we have a backdoor flush draw with the three clubs. And also, it's relatively unlikely that either player has much on this board. If I check in this scenario, it's probably because I got a physical read that one of the players liked their hand. And this happens very often in live poker where you'll see a flop come and one of the players will visibly look excited. Or sometimes you see the opposite. You'll see one of the players obviously become uninterested, and that guy is effectively folded, assuming he is honest in his actions, and you can figure that out by paying attention to your opponents. So in this hand, I did check behind, and when I check behind, that sort of implies that I thought one of these two players has something that they like. So turns the jack of clubs. So now there are four clubs on board, and I have a gut shot straight draw plus a flush draw. It's a pretty good hand. And small blind checks, big blind checks, and I decide to bet 1,600 into the 3,150 pot. This is a spot where, at this point, I would assume the best hand that most of my opponents have is a marginal queen. I doubt I'm against something like two pair very often. And most of the time, both of my opponents are just going to have nothing, because most players, if they had a queen or even a reasonable jack, would bet the turn for value and protection, although betting for protection is often not such a great idea, because usually if someone has a good draw, you're pricing them in regardless. So I think that most of my opponents are going to be folding in this scenario, or most players are going to be folding in this scenario almost every time. So I bet 1,600, and usually I expect this to steal the pot. And if I do get called, I still have plenty of equity. So to my surprise, well, small blind folds, not very surprising. But to my surprise, big blind check raises to 3,600. So I made it 1,600, he made it 3,600. So it's only 2,000 more to call. In this spot, we are getting amazing pot odds, such that we're certainly not folding. The only question is, should we re-raise in this scenario? And typically, when someone check raises the turn, it's usually a relatively strong hand. You're going to find that most players are not check raising in this spot as a bluff. If it is, it's probably a really strong draw, but I have some of the strong draws blocked, meaning it's, my opponent can't have king 9 of clubs, for example, or 10-9 of clubs, because I have the 9 of clubs in my hand. Same thing for the 8s, although the 8 doesn't block the premium draws. I would not be surprised to see something like ace 10 of clubs, though. I think that would be perfectly reasonable. But most of the time, I think this is going to be a strong hand. So whenever my opponents check to me on the turn, and I decided to bet because I thought they just were going to be weak most of the time, that read is now all of a sudden changed, because now this player is check raised. This guy is almost certainly not doing this with absolutely nothing. So he has something. If he has something, do I really want to try to make him fold that hand, where at this current point in the hand, I'm getting really good odds? Whenever you have a draw, you always have to ask yourself, am I getting the right odds to call? And if the answer is yes, calling's usually not so bad. If the answer is no, maybe because if I bet 1,600, my opponent raised to 7,000, for example, calling's no longer a great option because I'm not getting the right price. So when that happens, you have to ask, should I be re-raising or folding? And you're re-raising to try to make your opponent fold. You have to rely on fold equity to make that scenario profitable for you. So anyway, when he raises small, I'm going to call and just hope to get there on the river. If I don't get there on the river, I'm probably just giving up. I do get there on the river, the 10 of clubs. That's good. So now I have a straight flush. You don't make too many straight flushes in No Limit Hold'em, but sometimes you're lucky. And even more lucky, my opponent decides to bet 5,000, leaving himself 15,000 left in his stack. He bet 5,000 into the 10,000 pot. So I'm obviously raising. I have to ask, is there an amount I can raise that will make my opponent fold something like a worse flush or even a set? And I think you're going to find that in general, when the backdoor draw comes in, most people are not going to assume that you could possibly have the backdoor draw. And especially in like middle stakes and small stakes live tournaments, players are just not aware that those hands should make up a lot of your range when you check behind on the flop. And for that reason, I think if this player does have a reasonably strong hand, or at least a hand that he perceives to be strong, like Queen Jack or maybe pocket sixes, he's just going to call off every single time if I go all in. You'll find that a lot of players will min raise in this spot or raise small, thinking their opponent can, or thinking their opponent's going to fold to a big all in if they do not have a flush. But that's just not what I've experienced in the small and middle stakes tournaments. And this is a $1,000 tournament, $1,000 live tournament, so it's not a particularly high stakes tournament. I think that a lot of the players are going to be making pretty big errors. So this is a spot where I want to raise large, and any raise size more than like 12,000 starts to become an amount that risks my opponent's whole stack. So I'm fine just going all in this scenario. I do not think my opponent should call here very often, but I think my opponent will call fairly often. And you always have to ask yourself, am I trying to be balanced or am I trying to exploit my opponent? And the main time you want to be balanced, meaning you're trying to make a play that your opponent cannot easily exploit, is when your opponents are very good. But this guy I have labeled as a splashy guy, and like I said, this is a middle stakes tournament. So this player probably has leaks in his game, and I'm going to try to take advantage of those leaks. And for whatever reason, in this specific spot, I thought that this guy had the leak of calling probably any all-in in this spot because he's not even aware that I could have a very good hand. So I did go all in, and he instantly called. When he instantly called, I'm like, oh, no, he has ace-king of clubs somehow. But then he folded and showed a queen. So clearly he called with a relatively weak hand. I doubt he had pocket queens. He would have re-raised that pre-flop, so he probably had two pair. And two pairs are in a pretty nasty spot on this run out. And this is a pretty clear example of my opponent just vastly overplaying a marginal made hand. What my opponent probably should have done, assuming he decided to check raise with something like Queen Jack on the turn, is he probably should have checked this river or bet this river with the intention of folding if he got raised. And if you know your opponent's just not capable of folding hands they perceive to be big, you should be more than happy to go for full value. Do not let them off the hook by raising small. Notice if I raise small on this river, my opponent would have ended up saving 7,000 chips or so. And that is quite significant. In this tournament, we started with 20,000 chips. So if I win an extra 7,000 in this hand, that's equivalent to winning an extra $300 or $350, somewhere in there. And if you're picking up an extra $350 in this spot every time it comes up, and I don't mean like whenever you have a straight flush. I mean whenever you have an effective nut hand and you think your opponent has a good but not nut hand, that's going to add a pretty good amount to your win rates. So that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you think, and I will talk to you next time.